Excellent. So we are officially live, I believe. Started right at 10 o'clock. Everybody, if folks can now take a moment, I know we asked you to unmute yourselves and test your audio. If you can now mute yourselves. We have just a few housekeeping things that we'd like to walk through. We have a packed agenda and are just really excited to have you all here today for the first learning session of the Washington Climate Assembly. So we were just saying, as folks were trickling in, hope you've got your water, your tea, your coffee, your Red Bull, whatever it is, to get started. We can do kind of our final stretch before we dive in. If folks have something that they'd like to share in the chat, feel free to just let us know how you're feeling about today's meeting, or in general, how are you feeling in general at this particular moment? And feel free to enter one word in the chat box, and we'll just give folks just a moment to get settled. And yeah, we're just really excited to get started, and it's really exciting to see all of your faces as well. So happy, motivated, sleepy, good, ready, hungry, grab something to eat. Got to take care of yourself on these calls.
Does it look okay?
Have a headache, but doing good otherwise. Waking up, totally hear that, ready and alert. Good morning, everybody. Glad to have power back. I'm very glad that you have power.
The Gonzaga game this afternoon.
Okay, we will end on time. That's one of my facilitation golden rules to facilitation, end on time.
Right, well, it doesn't start till 7, so we should be all right.
Okay, perfect. We will definitely end before 7. Having a good day. Some folks are saying how long they were out for power. That's a long time.
Is the chat
excellent? Thank you everybody so much for sharing. And as I mentioned, welcome to the first learning session for the day, or for our whole Washington Climate Assembly. And I do just want to take a moment too, as well, that we did have a few questions about folks that are not Assembly members and where's the link to join, because this is being live streamed. And the meeting, the Assembly meetings and the on this Zoom platform are just for Assembly members, presenters, and observers, and then the coordinating team as well. So, but we are doing it live so that folks outside of the Assembly can also follow along and see what you all are talking about, what you all are learning about, and so that's the difference between those two pieces. I did just want to do a land acknowledgement also before we get started. And as we'll do at the beginning of every meeting, we wish to acknowledge that the people of Washington State live and work on tribal lands of the Indigenous people who've been here since time immemorial. There are 29 federally recognized tribes and 7 non-federally recognized tribes within the boundaries of Washington State. Tribes and tribal people bring thousands of years of traditional knowledge to our present moment. Tribes bring an important and vital voice to the current conversation, and we honor our tribal relations. If you haven't done so, we've been, as you all have been trickling in, reminding folks to rename yourselves. For the duration of the assembly, we are asking folks to sign in using your first name and your location if you're an Assembly member. If you are a presenter, please use your full name, comma, presenter. And then the coordinating team, you'll notice folks that are helping to coordinate this effort, our full name, comma, coordinating team. So that helps everybody know who is who and keeps us organized. And then we also have a graphic recorder on the call today, and she'll be graphically recording this, which is really cool, throughout the course of the entire assembly. And we'll be sharing her work as well, and that's Ann Jess. Cue to get started. Any questions on the agenda so far?
No.
Okay. And Brent, if you could just give me a thumbs up when we're good to go.
Apologies for that. Our live stream went down and we had to quickly get it going back up again. So apologies for that. That also means the closed captioning won't work right now, unfortunately. So sorry, we'll get it fixed for next time. Okay.
Okay, excellent. So here we go. So we've got these two parts. We've got part 1, 3 presenters. We'll have a Q&A, a break, and then part 2 with a set of presenters, a Q&A, and then we'll close with next steps. And we are meeting from 10 a.m. until 1 p.m. today. And so just wanting to remind folks, we do have a formal break, but if you ever need to step away for a moment to grab water, to grab something to eat, please take care of yourselves during these meetings. There's a lot that we'll be sharing today, and really just want to make sure that you take care of yourselves in the interim. So we can go ahead to the next slide, please. Okay, so a quick recap, and this is our first agenda item for the day. Just a really quick recap of the structure of the learning sessions and the topics. So learning session structure. Great, thanks so much, Wendy. So as we mentioned, our meetings on Tuesdays are 2 hours, so we have fewer presenters on Tuesdays than we do on Saturdays. Some Saturdays will have up to 10 presenters. You will receive, as you did this time, a meeting packet from Wendy. Our goal is 2 days before each of the meetings, and in that meeting packet, you'll have the list of presenters and any support materials that those presenters have provided us in advance. We'll be sharing those with you. We're emailing all of this stuff. If email isn't working for you, please let us know, and either give us a call, or I was gonna say send us an email, but if email isn't working for you, that isn't the best option. Just let us know, because we really wanna make sure that you get these materials and in a way that works for you. And your role in these learning sessions, and on the right, you'll see this graphic of kind of this 4-step process to our assembly meetings. We are in the first phase, the learning phase, and your role is really listening and asking any questions that come up. And throughout the course of these learning sessions as well, if you have a recommendation, because you'll notice in the second phase, the deliberative phase, you'll be talking about all of the recommendations that have come forward, whether from presenters, whether from fellow assembly members, or the general public. Anybody can submit a recommendation for consideration by you all. So if you do have a recommendation, and on Tuesday's meeting, we'll get into the details of how you submit a recommendation. But that's your role for the assembly. And in terms of topics, this is page 1 of your meeting materials, and the learning session 1 topic area is an introduction to climate change and climate mitigation. And so quite general, and just kind of laying that foundation, getting us all on the same starting page, same platform, as we dive in a little bit more deeply into some of the more specific topics that we'll get at some of the future learning sessions. And the list of presenters continues to grow. So we have a set number of presenters today, but we are accommodating presenters as they come in to wanting to talk to you. Great. So reminder too that ultimately your charge as assembly members is to deliberate on and provide solutions to the question that's on the screen here. And all presenters have also received this question, and they'll be addressing this question in various ways throughout their presentations. Many of them will also be submitting recommendations related to this question for you all to consider during the deliberative phase of the assembly. As assembly members, you all can also submit a recommendation on this topic at any point during the learning sessions. And as I mentioned, in Tuesday's meeting, we'll show you exactly where you can do that and what that looks like. We'll be compiling a list of all the recommendations received at the end of the learning sessions for you all to consider and deliberate on during those deliberative sessions. All right, so who are the presenters? So we've got 2 different types of presenters, and we think this is really important because if I was an assembly member, I'd want to know, who are these people? Who are these people that are coming to talk to me? And there are 2 types. There are that are specified in the rule book, which is the kind of set of guidelines that we're using for the Washington Climate Assembly, which is posted on the Washington Climate Assembly website. And the definition of experts is any individual who specializes in the subject of the assembly by profession, education, training, skill, or expertise. And the role of experts is to transfer that knowledge to you all. And the coordinating team invites experts based on our knowledge of the subject, and that's how experts come to be invited to present to you all. The second category is interested parties. Those are organizations, institutions, or informal groups whose activity is related to the subject of the assembly and who is directly affected by issues raised during the assembly. And anybody can request to present. And if they meet the above criteria, that first bullet under interested parties, they can present their ideas either by oral testimony and/or written comments, proposals, or suggestions. Great. So that is it on that slide. Thanks, Wendy. So how do I ask a question to the presenter? So this is a format that we'll be using throughout the course of the learning sessions. As we mentioned, anytime a question comes up related to the topic that the presenter is presenting on, please type in a question into chat. And if this is specific, if your question is specific to a particular presenter, let us know that, because then we'll say, you know, for instance, Preston is one of our presenters today. So if your question is to him, then we will ask that directly to him based on the question that you put in the chat box. And then one nuance here, and we're going to try this out, and you can let us know, you know, at the end of the session if this worked for you. But we're going to get a lot of, hopefully we'll get a lot of questions from you all throughout the course of the morning. And as I mentioned, we'll do our best to address as many questions as possible during the Q&A. We may not get to all of them, but in terms of how we prioritize what questions are asked during this Q&A, if you see a question that one of your fellow assembly members has asked, then what we'd like you to do is put in the +1 at and that person's name, because that means that you think that question that assembly member X, say Sarah, asked is a really important one. And you also agree that you want that question asked. So, and we'll remind you of this during the Q&A as well, but in the chat, you would put in +1 at and then the name. And we've got a team of coordinating team members that are here today who are going to be monitoring the chat throughout the course of the morning and into the afternoon. And so we are tracking your questions and are excited about your questions. And Derek put a prompt in here that shows you exactly what we're thinking about, and that will help us prioritize those questions that folks share across that you really want answered. All right, so we can go to the next slide, Wendy. One thing that we thought was really important as we embark on this journey together is that to kind of set the stage for some discussion guidelines. And you all, as assembly members, represent the makeup of Washington State. We have approximately half men, half women. We have an age range from 16 years on. You all represent across Washington, across congressional districts, across income levels, across race/ethnicity, and education level. You also represent a range of opinions backed by earlier studies about whether global warming is happening, is caused mostly by human activities, and whether the individual is worried about global warming. So as I mentioned on Tuesday night, the Washington Climate Assembly will serve as an example for how people from all walks of life, representing a range of beliefs and viewpoints, can roll up your sleeves and find common ground on this very complex issue. So in order for us to create an online community that fosters this type of discourse, I'm going to walk through a few discussion guidelines that will serve us really, really well from here on out, both in these learning sessions as well as the deliberative sessions. Okay, and I do want to give credit where credit is due. I adapted this list from Healthy Democracy and something that they presented during their 2020 Oregon Citizen Assembly pilot on COVID-19 recovery earlier this fall. So a few guidelines here, and if you think of any others that are missing here, feel free to share them in the chat based on other group experiences that you've had and what's worked really well. So using respectful body language and verbal language. So we're all in this together, and we may be a tiny little square on Zoom, but we can all still see each other. So really, that's a very important one. And attending all the sessions, but we do recognize that you may not be able to attend every single session, but doing your absolute best to be here for as many sessions, if not all of the sessions as possible. And climate mitigation is a really huge topic. So this third bullet here, keeping focus on the topic. But what we've done in terms of how we've structured this is we've broken down that topic into subtopic areas. And so when I just showed you that slide of the various different topics for our different learning sessions, those are really subtopics within the climate mitigation huge field. And so when you're asking questions, please try to ask questions that are related to the topic of the day, as the presenters that are here today will be best equipped to respond to the questions that relate to their topic. Please speak clearly and briefly. Share your airtime with your fellow assembly members. There are a lot of you, which is awesome. But we also really want to hear from everybody as well. Bringing your full self, whatever that means to you. But we only have 34 hours together of assembly time, which at our very first Saturday may seem like a lot, but it goes really fast. And every moment is precious. So please bring your full self to these meetings, minimizing distractions, and turning off your text messages, just staying as focused as you possibly can, but finding that balance. Obviously, if you need to get up and grab a glass of water, a cup of coffee, whatever you need to take care of yourself throughout our time together as well. Being open to new ideas, that's a really important one as well. And then I really love this one, disagree positively. And we may not have the same opinions, but we're looking at the same issue and we're trying to find solutions to it. And then the final one, we know this is an intense topic and there is structure to these meetings, but trying to infuse fun wherever we can, and just so happy that you all are here. And as you're able, just showing up as fully as you possibly can. And with that is all that I had. And just want to pause for a moment before I turn it back over and introduce the speakers. Just see in the chat if there are any questions. I know we went through quite a bit there. See if there are any questions.
For the questions, feel free to unmute yourself and speak. Otherwise, you can also type into the chat.
Yeah. Any process related questions before we get started? Okay, great. So we are moving right into our presentations. Maybe before we do that, if you want to just give yourself a stretch, if you want to stand up for a minute, take a deep breath, do whatever you need to do for just a moment before we get started. I'm stretching as well. And I'm going to introduce each of the speakers and referencing, you also have longer bios for each of the presenters today in your meeting materials, but I will just do a quick introduction. We've got great speakers, and just right off the bat, just really want to thank all the presenters who are here with us today. And Preston Hardison is our first presenter, and he's presenting on tribal and Indigenous sovereignty and climate change. Preston Hardison is a retired non-tribal employee of the Tulalip Natural Resources Office of Treaty Rights, where he worked for 2 decades on defending Tulalip treaty rights to resources, lands, and water, with a focus on salmon and climate change issues. He also represented the Tulalip tribes in negotiations in various bodies and has worked with national tribal climate change policy and assessments to the National Climate Change Assessment, the Congressional Climate Action Plan. He co-authored guidelines for considering traditional knowledge in climate change adaptation and has been endorsed by the U.S. Department of Interior. Welcome, Preston. Thank you so much for being here. And with that, I will turn it over to you. And just a quick reminder to you, and maybe we can put this in the prompt again, Derek, just asking questions. Really important to ask questions as they come up throughout the course of the morning in each of these different presentations.
Yeah,
welcome, Preston. And
about that really quickly, folks, feel free to also just take notes on paper if using the chat is difficult, so that you can have your question captured in the moment. So either use the chat or write it down and then speak it later.
Great. Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, Derek. And with that, welcome, Preston, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Gretchen, and welcome to all. And I'm very excited and happy to be here. Today, I'm going to talk about issues of tribal sovereignty and climate change, focusing on the sovereignty aspect. Next slide. First, I'd like to thank the Duwamish tribe for this opportunity to speak from and work on and live in their ancestral lands. Briefly, I want to comment on land acknowledgements. It's not really just a pro forma statement that you make at the beginning of a speech on somebody's lands and tribal culture. When people go onto other people's lands, they are also acknowledging that they will respect those peoples and abide by their protocols and their customs. This presentation is quite generic. It's going to be non-technical, and I want to state that it does not necessarily represent the views of any tribes. Of course, I'm focusing on sovereignty. There are 29 federally recognized tribes and 7 non-federally recognized tribes in Washington State. They all have the right to speak for themselves. And so any questions or details or disputes about what I say, the views of the sovereigns should be respected. Next slide. So in beginning working with tribes, they ask that their sovereignty be taken into account. And I want to also say, sovereignty is not something that they always push into the public's face. They're willing in general to work with the citizens of Washington State, with Washington State. But what I want to cover today is they are in fact sovereigns, and that has certain implications. They have self-determination on using their own worldviews, their own values, spirituality, traditions, beliefs, concepts, methodologies, practices, and approaches to navigating their life worlds. Next slide. Sovereignty is the collective right of peoples. For example, the United States is a sovereign, France is a sovereign, the state of Washington is a sovereign. So the idea of sovereignty is that peoples as a collective have the right to self-determination, to autonomy in their development, and to self-governance and their decision-making over their territories and their resources. Sovereignty for tribes comes from the Constitution of the United States, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3, where Congress has the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. In the Constitution, treaties are the supreme law of the land. And by that, they mean that they are binding on all citizens, binding on all states, and binding on the federal government. They are one of the most sovereign or one of the most solemn contracts that the United States enters into. So they are quite special and of quite high in order, and that should be borne in mind. Next slide. Now, where does it come from in theory? In international law, the law of the rights of nations, it is based on rights in the soil, rights from long inhabitation of a place. Sovereigns are distinct, independent political communities that have the inherent authority to govern their territories. Inherent is an important word, and I will return to that later on. And I do want to say something about, we had a senator at one point who used to claim that tribes thinks that they're super citizens. Tribal governments are not super citizens. They are sovereigns. They're not even really citizens as governments. They act as sovereigns just like the United States acts as sovereigns. And they have the right as sovereigns to uniquely organize and express their cultures, which is different, but not higher, not lower, but of the same status as other sovereigns of the world. Next slide. That was not supposed to be there. Next slide. So the question of what exactly does sovereignty mean for the tribes was questioned early on in our history as a nation. Here are 3 cases I'm not going to discuss them in detail, just they're available to you, and I'll present some links that people can go to and look them up if they're interested. They're known as the Cherokee cases or the Marshall Trilogy after Chief Justice John Marshall. In that, the state of Georgia questioned the sovereignty and asserted dominion over the tribes of Georgia. Next slide. Out of these cases and further decisions by the Supreme Court, which is called judicial review, the Supreme Court found that the rights of the tribes originate in the treaty-making clause of the Constitution, and that treaties are negotiated and concluded between nations and states. They also concluded that these rights are inherent. It means that they're pre-existing. They were rights that the tribes of the United States had by virtue of being here before the citizens of what became the United States. They came from their rights in the soil and inhabiting the land. These rights are recognized. They're not granted by the United States, and that's a very important point. The United States does not grant tribes rights. They are recognized. And again, there are multiple decisions of the Supreme Court that reaffirm this status. Today, we call this the government-to-government relationship between the United States and tribes, and the government-to-government relationship between the state of Washington and tribes. And because of this, tribes are not mere stakeholders. And when they say they're not stakeholders, they mean that they are inherent sovereign rights holders. Next slide. There are some other kinds of ideas that have been put forward by the Supreme Court in their judicial review. First is the plenary power doctrine, that only Congress has the authority to make laws and decisions regarding the tribes. They regulate the commerce with the tribes, not the executive branch, not the president, not the judicial branch. So the findings of Congress are considered to be supreme, and they're the only ones who can make that. They also found a trust relationship exist in the United States relationships to the tribes. The federal government has a duty to protect tribal sovereign rights and establish measures and authorities to achieve this. And again, remember that these are the supreme law of the land, so that states are expected to also abide by this trust relationship. Next slide. There are also what are called the canons of construction. These are a little bit more informal and they have not been applied consistently, but they are repeatedly applied in Supreme Court decisions. Treaties should be interpreted as tribes understood them, is the first. So we go back into the historical record, we interview the tribes today, we look at the historical record, and we try to understand how did the tribes understand these treaties. They should be construed liberally in favor of the tribes. There is a recognition that the treaty negotiations were difficult, often rushed, they were often coerced, they were often in a language that the tribes didn't fully understand, and so that the interpretation should be liberally and generously applied. Ambiguities in the interpretation of laws must be resolved in favor of the tribes. Next slide. Next slide. Boy, I don't know where all these came from. Okay. So that's kind of the background, setting up where the sovereignty comes from, the status of the sovereignty, and I hope that people are understanding the nature of the treaties. Here are the treaties from Washington State. Again, I'm not going to cover any of these, and I just wanted to give a list so that if people want to go and read the treaties, they can see what they say. Next slide. There are 29 federally recognized tribes in Washington State. 22 of these are treaty tribes. 7 are what are called executive order tribes. There's 1 state recognized tribe, so it's not recognized by the federal government, but recognized by the state of Washington. And there are 7 non-federally recognized tribes. Now, there is a difference in the rights of these different statuses, and I won't go into the complexity. It's quite complex. You really have to look at the individual treaties with the tribes. In general, treaty tribes and executive order tribes are considered to be sovereigns by the United States. However, the treaty tribes are generally viewed as they do have superior rights by the fact that they signed treaties between nations. Executive order tribes are sovereign, but they generally only have rights to the territories that they were assigned. Now, again, I don't want to go into detail. I'll just say treaty making ended in 1872 because of a dispute between the House of Representatives and the Senate over funding treaties, among other things. After that date, there were some other tribes that were federally recognized by executive order. Treaty tribes often reserved rights outside of their reservations. Next slide. Here's a list of the tribes. Next slide. So what was the purpose of the treaties? The treaties were to a way to have a protected area that was a fraction of their original land base that was needed to continue their ways of life. And it's important to understand that when the treaty tribes concluded their treaties, they reserved off-reservation rights because the signers of those treaties understood that the lands that they were being offered that were a fraction of their original land base were not enough to continue their ways of life. And so that they would depend on open and unclaimed lands where they could gather and hunt, and usual and accustomed places where they could fish. So in thinking about these rights that they reserve, they're not simply kind of easements. In legal terms, these are called usufruct rights. These are reserved sovereign rights. They're rights that were reserved by treaty of sovereigns. And so they're not just simple easements, they are actually sovereign easements of a sovereign right that was never terminated. So the duty to protect, it not only applies to on-reservation rights, it applies to off-reservation treaty rights as well. Next slide. Before I go there, I've apparently left off one slide that's important just to understand in international law and in national law that when, these rights are, when rights are ceded by a sovereign in a treaty, they must be explicitly ceded within the treaty. Nothing in a treaty is ceded by accident. And this applies to any kind of treaty. In the United States, they would not go into foreign negotiations and give up any of their rights by implication. So it is in treaty interpretation, you can't say, oh, well, Congress passed this law. It didn't mention the tribes. It had nothing to do with the tribes, but by implication, the tribes have now lost their right to X, Y, and Z. That's not how treaties work. They're mostly about specified limitations on behavior and actions that have been agreed to among sovereigns. If you are silent on something, if you don't mention it in a treaty, it is reserved. That is called the reserved rights doctrine, and that applies not just to tribal treaties, but to all treaties. Now this slide, I wanted to give you just an overview, just to remind everybody that this is a map drawn up, a census map from 1854, when Washington was not even a territory. And and before the treaties were negotiated. And just to remind everybody that the tribes occupied and were recognized as occupying the entire state territory of Washington. Next slide. And this is a map of the tribes today. So if you will look at those yellow portions, under treaty law and under the reserved rights doctrines, there are reserved rights, sovereign rights that the tribes have on those lands in yellow. Again, it's complex. There are, laws. It's not saying that they can come onto your private property and do whatever they want to, but understand that at least on the federal estate and the federal lands, that tribes still have reserved sovereign rights. So when you think of federal lands, they're not just the public's lands. There are reserved sovereign tribal rights on those lands. Next slide. Now so that's kind of the background to sovereignty that I wanted to get across. The tribes have reserved rights. They have their territorial rights on their reservations. There was this highest and utmost agreement between the United States that resources and lands would be available to them to continue on with their lifeways. And that's how they understood the treaties. It's also important to understand, especially when you're looking at climate change impacts and that a little bit about their worldviews. I won't go into detail, but just first, it's relational. It's not always about things, but about their relationships to one another, to the natural world, to spiritual and other beings. It is deeply spiritual. Almost everything is tied to spirituality. I would say everything in my experience. It's deeply respectful. It respects all beings and all entities and all peoples. It is backward looking and forward looking. It looks to past and future generations. It is actually less rights oriented than obligations oriented. They have obligations to families and communities, but also, and again, very important to understand, to more than human beings, to entities like mountains, rivers, the sea, to their relatives, and not all those relatives are human, and to nations. And it's not simply the political nations of the United States or of the world, but as they often express it in different tribes, all my relations. Those are all the living beings and entities of the world. Next slide. So in their ways of decision making and thinking about the world, think of the present as this thin little slice in the middle. And that little slice is highly amplified. Remember that they've been here for 600 generations or more. Washington State citizens have been here for about 6 generations, if you take generation time to be about 25 years under the current time. And that, of course, is under our worldview. What they would say is we have been here forever and since time immemorial. So they take the past into account. They have to show respect to their ancestors, but they also have to be good ancestors. They are always mindful that their decisions will affect future generations, and that is actually time in perpetuity. And you might often hear about the 7 generations. In reality, it's 14 generations because it's 7 generations back, 7 generations forward. That's one group of tribes' beliefs about the 7 generations, but they all believe in looking to the ancestors and taking care of the future. Next slide. Finally, I want to discuss very briefly the concept of free, prior, informed consent. As I said, relationships with tribes are government to government. They're between sovereigns. In 2007, there was the culmination of a 25-year process in the United Nations to negotiate principles of Indigenous peoples' rights, called the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And again, these are the rights that international negotiators recognized and didn't grant to Indigenous peoples. They said these are the rights that they have by virtue of their inherent rights. And the United States is a signatory to this. There's some debate on how binding it is, but it's not strictly binding because it's a declaration, but it's a very high order set of principles, and many believe that it just codifies existing laws. It's not inventing new laws, but it's looking at the fundamental human rights that Indigenous peoples have as peoples as opposed to as individuals. But it's not really different from the fundamental human rights of all peoples of the world. In that declaration, there is a duty to obtain free, prior, and informed consent for any development or activity that directly or indirectly impacts or impinges on the rights of Indigenous peoples. So in our case, because we have off-reservation rights, tribes say that the citizens and the government of the state of Washington and the United States have to get their permission when there are major adverse impacts on their lands and resources. And this applies both on reservation and off reservation. Free means it should be uncoerced. Prior means that they should be brought in from the very beginning at the earliest stages and not brought in as an afterthought. And that their consent should be obtained before any major activity occurs. And it should be informed. They should understand all of the potential consequences of those activities. And this is important for climate change. Next slide. So, in summary, understand that tribes can be harmed by direct and indirect impacts of climate change. It's not just about the impacts of warming. It's also can be the impacts on that warming has on other things like the price of things, the availability and scarcity, on decision making surrounding responses to climate change. You should also be mindful of the non-climate impacts, and they should be taken into account too, because non-climate impacts exacerbate or can make worse climate change impacts, and they interact with them. It's also good to be cognizant that mitigation and adaptation actions, those responses can also be harmful to tribes. Now, I have one that's really about adaptation and not mitigation, but I think it will make this clear. One of the major impacts of climate change will be increased flooding from heavier rains and sea level rise. One way to deal with increased flooding is to increase your stormwater capacity, which means expanding your stormwater system and building more conveyance systems to move stormwater and so on, and expand their size and the ability to take more volume. What that means is laying pipes, and in putting the pipes into the ground, you can disturb burial sites, you can disturb cultural sites. And these are sacred places, and in the Indigenous worldview, as I mentioned, they are not only just spiritual places, but they have living entities and living spirit attached to them. So, and this has happened. This is an evidence-based statement that some of the responses can harm tribes. So again, think in terms of both the tangible and the intangible impacts. It's not simply about the impacts on things. Next slide. So that's my presentation. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer questions, and I will be sending information and links to help supplement this for your consideration. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Preston. And we do have a question in the chat, but we do have a formal kind of Q&A period. So we've put that in our Google Doc, and if you can stick around to the question and answer period, we'll bring that forward. It looks like a lot of folks are wanting to hear a response to the question that's in the chat.
Yes, happy to.
Great. Thank you very much for sharing all of that great information. We are going to pause just for a moment between each of our presenters. I will introduce just by name our presenter, and then we'll read the presenter's bio in just a second, but just given a little bit of space, you heard a lot of information over the last 20 minutes. I'm going to pause for a moment here. Okay, great. And recognizing too, we actually got a really great comment from one of the Assembly members that there is a lag time in real time versus remote time, which is what we're living in right now. And so it may seem like an awkwardly long time to pause, but recognizing just wanting to create that space between presenters. So thank you so much for that suggestion as well. And along the way, if there are things that would make your time with all of us a bit more comfortable, a bit more meaningful, please let us know. So with that, we're going to move right into our next presenter, Georgine Yorgi. And please let me know, that works? Okay, great. And Georgine is presenting on greenhouse gas emissions and climate mitigation opportunities in Washington State with examples from agriculture. So Georgine is Associate Director of Washington State University's Center for Sustaining Agriculture and Natural Resources, where she's worked since 2009. Areas of her work include climate change in agriculture, the food, energy, water nexus, and recovery and reuse of organic wastes in agriculture. Her recent efforts include the Farmer to Farmer case studies, enhancing resilience of farming in the Pacific Northwest, and a range of other non-academic and academic resources. Welcome, Georgine, and thank you so much for joining us today. And with that, I will turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. And the screen sharing is working okay? You can see my slide and nothing else?
Yes, we can see your slide.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to try and do sort of two things in the short time that I have with you this morning. The first is to give a very brief introduction to overview of mitigation and what it is. And then second, to provide some examples from large scale agriculture. That's because that's the area I work on, both mitigation and adaptation of agriculture in the Pacific Northwest, but also because I think it's helpful to make some of these ideas a little bit more concrete and give you some indication of how complex it is. So the first part, I'm going to talk a little bit, what do we mean by mitigation? And then where do Washington's climate emissions come from and what might be the implications of that for mitigation? So when we talk about climate mitigation, right, we're essentially talking about slowing the amount of greenhouse gases that are emitted into our atmosphere and then turning that around. So ultimately trying to have less warming gases in our atmosphere. A couple of slides, so many of you may know this already, but just to make sure that we're all starting from sort of some of the same big picture basis. We have a number of different greenhouse gases that contribute to warming, and each of those gases in our atmosphere provides a different amount of warming and has a different lifespan. So once it's emitted into our upper atmosphere, how long does it stay there and provide warming? So when we talk about mitigation, we often, and we're thinking at that big picture level, we often convert all of those greenhouse gases into what's called carbon dioxide equivalents. You might see CO2e, that's what that means. But essentially we're expressing each of those individual gases in terms of the amount of warming provided by carbon dioxide. We have to do that over a specific time frame, usually that's 100 years. So we're trying to make them comparable. The other thing that's kind of underlying here that I think is helpful to really keep in mind is that what we're talking about with climate change is really an imbalance in our carbon cycle, right? So carbon cycles and has always cycled between our atmosphere and our lands and our oceans. So this just shows you some of those flows. And the reason, to some extent, the greenhouse effect, right? The fact that our atmosphere holds in warmth is what makes our planet habitable. But the problem is, and the reason we're concerned about climate change is that we've created an imbalance in that we have too much warming in our atmosphere, because we have taken what was fossil carbon stored deep in our earth and we've emitted it to the atmosphere. So right, that red arrow showing the human emissions of carbon. So one thing that means is when we're talking about mitigation, we're usually talking about two different buckets. On the one hand, cutting or eliminating further emissions of greenhouse gases into our atmosphere. And on the other hand, enhancing actions that will pull carbon out of the atmosphere and store it elsewhere in our lands. So this is a graph that shows you how those kind of two big buckets of strategies could potentially come together. As a graph from the UN. That top yellow line is showing, business as usual greenhouse gas emissions continuing to increase, at least to a certain point in the future. That green part, that green shaded part is, they call them conventional abatement technologies. You can think about those as greenhouse gas mitigation strategies. And that's right. That's not one strategy, but that's a whole bunch of different actions that each would reduce emissions of greenhouse gases and get us to that line that's in between the brown and the green on this graph. The reason that doesn't go to zero is that there are some greenhouse gas emissions that either are going to be very prohibitively expensive to eliminate or potentially impossible to eliminate. And I will give you an example from agriculture. Nitrous oxide emissions come from the soils. It comes from natural microbial processes in the soils. Nitrous oxide is a very powerful greenhouse gas. There are definitely things that we know about which we can do to reduce nitrous oxide emissions, and yet the idea that we would eliminate them completely is probably a non-starter. Those lands that are not in agricultural production also emit some amount of nitrous oxide. The idea that we would have no agricultural production is also kind of a non-starter. So that blue wedge below the graph are carbon, they're calling them carbon removal technologies. You can also think about them as carbon sequestration. These are the strategies that are pulling additional carbon out of the atmosphere. And so you can see then the combination of the gross negative greenhouse gas emissions, that blue wedge, and the green wedge is what puts you on this red line. So in this scenario, they're looking at how could we keep warming below 2 degrees centigrade. I don't want to focus on, what is the specific right target, but I think it's very clear that we need to reduce greenhouse gases as quickly as we can, and that it's a combination of those two strategies that's going to get us there. Now I want to look a little bit at Washington State's greenhouse gas inventory. So these greenhouse gas inventories are done at national levels for nations around the world. They're also done for many states in the US, and they're set up in a very similar way. And that makes them, comparable across states or across nations. They're looking at, they basically take the economy and cut it up into different sectors and say, what are the direct emissions associated with that sector? When I say direct emissions, I mean emissions that are sort of under the control of people in that sector. So for example, the emissions in the agricultural sector include emissions from manure management. They do not include emissions from fertilizers, which are used in the agricultural industry. Those are captured in the industrial processes sector. So I think in telling you that, I think it's useful to say there is something that an inventory like this can tell us about how we mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, but it's of course a partial picture. So if you look at this greenhouse gas inventory for Washington State, this is the most recent one that we have, notice first that transportation is the largest source of emissions, followed by RCI is that next layer of the cake. That's residential, commercial, and industrial, mostly heating of those spaces, but also heat used for industrial processes. And then third, we have electricity. That electricity is not the electricity that's produced in our state, but the electricity that is consumed in our state. And I will say that in other states in the US where hydro is not such a big piece of the mix, electricity is often the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. And then I'll just make the point because I think it's helpful for later on in the slides. Agriculture is, agriculture is a fairly small portion of our greenhouse gas emissions. But remember, this is showing where do we emit greenhouse gases. Currently, it doesn't include that other half of the picture of where are the opportunities to sequester carbon. And for agriculture, that is one of the most important ways that we could contribute to mitigation. And forestry also, for the forestry sector. So before we move on, then I want to say, right, I told you that those emissions inventories are set up in a certain way, and that leads you to certain insights. I do think it's useful to look at other types of inventories. So this is an inventory that was done by our southern neighbors in Oregon, and it's what's called a consumption-based inventory. So instead of asking the question, what are the emissions by different sectors of our economy, it's asking the question, what are the goods and services that are consumed by our citizens? And what are the emissions associated with those activities, with the goods and services that our citizens consume? So look first at this circle in the upper right. And I think, one key thing you can take here is that of those goods and services, 34% of those emissions occur in the state of Oregon, whereas more than half of them, almost 2/3 of them, occur either in other states in the US or in other foreign countries. The other thing you can notice here is that second bar from the bottom, food and beverages. So if you take this consumption perspective on things, you can see that the food and drink that we consume accounts for a much bigger portion of emissions than you might think if you look just at what are the emissions from agriculture. And this might lead you to think more broadly about what kinds of mitigation strategies might really be impactful. For example, reducing food waste isn't likely to be an important piece of the picture in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions associated with food production. I put this slide in here because partly I think the consumption-based inventory kind of hints at this, but I think it's really worth pausing on this point for a minute, which is that Washington State is sort of a medium-sized state in a much larger country and in a much larger globe. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind when we think about how do we address climate change. And I think often when people say that, what they're trying to get at is, as much as we do to impact our greenhouse gas emissions, it doesn't make a lot of difference if the rest of the world doesn't act. And that is not the point I'm trying to make. I think, there are other countries in the world and other provinces and states that have really taken action on climate change. And we know that can be really important in a number of ways. The point that I am trying to make instead is that our economy is very highly linked to the rest of the globe and the rest of the country. And so if our action, I think we have to keep that in mind. If our actions to mitigate climate change merely move sources of emissions outside of our state's borders, we haven't really done much. So we need to be mindful of achieving true reductions in greenhouse gases, not just moving them elsewhere. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about a few examples from Washington agriculture. And in some sense, I would subtitle this part of my talk, why is it exciting? Why do I do the work that I do? And why is it complicated? And we haven't already gotten there. The first example I want to talk about is anaerobic digestion. So this is a technology, very well-established technology that takes organic waste and uses a specific set of microbial actors who digest, essentially eat those wastes, and then generate a biogas, a renewable gas. So it can result in mitigation in two pathways. First of all, sort of traditional methods for managing manure release greenhouse gases. So you're eliminating those emissions of greenhouse gases. You are also then generating this renewable, in this case, this is a digester at Etaline Dairy, which is in Linden, Washington, far northwest corner of Washington. You're also generating electricity, renewable electricity, and building the state's renewable electricity portfolio. So this is a great technology. Why, we see this is installed in somewhere around 8 dairies in Washington. Most of those were installed about 10 years ago, and we haven't seen a whole lot of expansion in the last 10 years. So why not? And the answer really has to do with economics. We've seen energy prices fall quite substantially over that time period nationally. And so that means, one key source of revenue that supports these digesters, helps people build them and maintain them, has fallen substantially. We've also seen the dairy industry as a whole, especially over the last several years, has been quite stressed economically. And so I think that makes them less likely to take on sort of new investments. There are people who are, there's a lot of work to try and sort of think creatively about how can we maintain the economics enough to support the digesters that exist and keep them viable. Some of that has to do with upgrading that biogas to make it useful for transportation. There's research efforts looking at other types of fuels that can be generated from these digesters, or other products that can be generated from these digesters. And one thing I'll say is most digesters do successfully tap into a carbon credit market. So they're receiving a payment for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But that is usually a small slice of the revenues that make a project like this viable. The second example I'll talk about that I think both has a lot of promise and is quite complicated is strategies around soil health and the Washington Soil Health Initiative. So I'll say first, so soil health strategies, most strategies that improve soil health have as really a cornerstone of them building the amount of carbon in soils. And that then pulls carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and sequesters it in soils. So potentially, quite large amounts of greenhouse gases can be sequestered in soils. There have been efforts around improving soil health, going back 30 years or more, because soil health strategies, in addition to kind of addressing climate, provide a lot of other both public benefits and benefits to producers who implement them, in terms of reducing soil erosion, in terms of clean water and clean air, in terms of supporting long-term productivity of agricultural soils. So it's really been, I would say, efforts around soil health have spanned the political spectrum. So you don't see the same kind of political, fragmentation that you see over climate issues. And I'm showing here Ron and Andy Juris. They're in Bickleton, Washington, sort of south central state. They're dryland wheat producers, and they use no-till, so they're not turning over soil, not releasing carbon into the atmosphere. They're also, here I'm showing a pretty cool piece of equipment they have called a stripper header. So that just, when they harvest grain, they just strip the grain off. They leave that whole plant in the field where it's standing, and then that ensures that more carbon gets input into their soils over time. The Washington Soil Health Initiative is a statewide initiative that was initiated in the last couple of years and helps support research around soil health issues. So I'll just say that implementing soil health in the diverse agricultural systems we have in the state is quite complicated. There's lots of things we know about what you can do to improve soil health, but there are also lots of remaining questions. And then also is supporting implementation of soil health strategies in the state. Two other points I'll make before I end, which is just number one, soil health strategies really support resilience of our agricultural systems to climate change. And I would say that the natural resource-based parts of our economy, agriculture and forestry, are quite vulnerable to impacts of climate change as we move forward. So that's one sort of nice thing, is that there can be this complementarity between the mitigation and adaptation. And secondly, I'll say that this soil health strategies don't fit that easily into sort of a carbon market framework. So we don't see that farmers who are implementing soil health are usually participating in carbon markets, although has been done once or twice, but it's very complex. And that has to do with the fact that there's a lot of complexity into what practice are you implementing and exactly how are you implementing it. But a lot of other things change exactly how much carbon you store. You know, what are your soils like? What crops are you growing? What were your soil carbon levels to begin with? And this just all, there's a sizable opportunity there, but it's also quite variable place to place across our landscape. So just end with a few key take homes. You know, I think there really is opportunity to address climate and to support other issues that are important to the citizens of Washington State. And I think I suspect these take homes apply to other sectors of our economy too. So if you're thinking, for example, about transportation. In the case of agriculture, you know, some of those other important issues are sustainable food production, clean air, clean water, building climate resilience, and supporting rural economies. And progress to date so far has relied on a combination of public investments and public interest, but also private actions by innovative individuals. I think it's really important to note that a single change can have impacts on multiple greenhouse gases, both direct and indirect, and it could be upstream of the farm or downstream of the farm. So if you implement no-till, you're not driving your tractor as much, so you're using less fuel, but you also are probably changing the inputs that you're using. So if we want to really achieve mitigation, we have to be cognizant of that fact. I think I talked quite a bit about farming and forestry have thin margins and competitive pressure is intense. So I think that mitigation needs to be cognizant of that if it's going to be successful. And then I hinted at the fact that farming and forest systems are incredibly complex managed ecosystems. And the fact that they're biological systems means it's a little bit more variable than, say, putting, I don't know, something on a factory or a tailpipe. And then I think I also probably hinted at the fact that some strategies for mitigation are really ready to deploy. And, you know, there's one or few key things holding them back, whereas other strategies are really still in development and there's a lot of research going on still. I'll end there and just say I will send a further reading list that you're welcome to peruse, and I welcome questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Georgine. And we are going to pause for just a moment between presenters. We have one more presenter before the Q&A. A lot of good questions coming in the chat that we are logging in our Google Doc that we'll be using during the Q&A. And we're just going to pause for a moment before we move into our final presenter for part 1 of the presentations this morning. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Georgine. And with that, I will introduce our final speaker for the part 1 presentation set. Shangri-La Joshi is presenting on the ethical considerations around climate policy and climate justice. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. Shangri-La Joshi is a member of the faculty in climate justice at the Evergreen State College. She has a doctoral degree in environmental sciences, studies, and policy. Her focal discipline is geography from the University of Oregon, a master's degree in international affairs from Ohio University, and a bachelor's of science degree in environmental sciences from St. Xavier's College and Kathmandu University, as part of Kathmandu University. Her research has focused on climate policy and politics at the international scale and in South Asia. Welcome so much, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak here. I'm honored to have been invited and to share this space with all of you. As requested, I will try to focus my presentation as much as possible on Washington State. Of course, Washington is part of the global community, as Georgine's presentation has highlighted. So it is also imperative that our actions at the state level are compatible with broader ethical imperatives and accountability to the rest of the world. Next slide, please. This photograph is from Copenhagen, where the 15th Conference of Parties on Climate Change took place. At the time, in 2009, there were calls for and hope for a fair, ambitious, and binding climate treaty that would replace the Kyoto Protocol. This was a global climate treaty that was widely condemned as too meager, but it did incorporate an equity principle called common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, which acknowledge the stark inequalities in responsibility, vulnerability, and capacity for mitigating climate change by creating emissions reductions targets proportional to responsibility and capability. Unfortunately, this equity provision has been eliminated in the Paris Agreement due in large part to US lobbying, and any ethical approach moving forward should strive to recenter equity among nations, as well as more ambitious targets for emission reductions. Next slide, please. So what is climate justice? I like to think of it as an aspirational idea, a way to address the climate crisis that is committed to minimizing and undoing existing forms of inequality and oppression so that we may move towards a more socially just and ecologically sustainable world. But climate justice has multiple connotations, and we should avoid conflating a highly pluralistic concept with one or two of its many meanings. That is why I refer to it as a multifaceted concept, because there are many different ideas about what is unjust and why, and which inequalities to focus on and how, just as there are many ideas about how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions or how to help communities cope. I refer to it as a multi-scalar concept because although the climate crisis is global, ideas about climate justice may be envisioned and operationalized at different scales, from global to local, including at the level of states. Next slide, please. The impacts of climate change, sea level rise, social natural disasters, and others hurt the socioeconomically weakest members of our global community the most. Pre-existing social vulnerabilities are further exacerbated, and therefore a climate justice lens is critical in any ethical approach to generating climate solutions. The notion of triple injustice of climate change suggests the infuriating irony that those who have the least responsibility for creating the problem globally also have the highest vulnerability and the least financial and technological capacity to address the problem. To this, I would add that we also need to be careful about the solutions to climate change that are created and whether they might create further inequities. So our solutions need to be fair, just, and equitable. At minimum, they should not add more layers of difficulty for those who are already more vulnerable and have contributed the least to the problem. Conversations about climate justice aren't new. They've been occurring since at least 1990. Back then, the conversations were focused on how these responsibilities, vulnerabilities, and capabilities were so unequally distributed across the global North and global South. Two main ways of conceptualizing this inequality were firstly, by thinking of cumulative greenhouse gas emissions and who is most responsible historically for problem creation. And secondly, by thinking of how emissions are distributed globally, averaged at the level of individual countries. In this way, industrialized countries such as the US were found to have tremendous responsibility relative to others, both in terms of cumulative emissions and ongoing high rates of emission. For instance, according to the World Resources Institute, the United States per capita greenhouse gas emissions in 2017 were 7 times that of Nepal, where I'm from. If you look at fossil fuel-based carbon emissions in 2019, based on the European Commission's EDGAR database, it is a shocking 31 times more. Of course, national averages often conceal disparities within countries since populations are differentiated along lines of race or caste, indigeneity, income level, and gender, but you do get a sense of global inequality with the cross-country comparisons. And when you add disparities in vulnerability or financial and technological capacity, the disparities can be even more stark. Therefore, there are calls for climate debt or reparations across global North and South. So here's something to think about for Washington State: how to repay our climate debts to the global South at a time when the US as a country has absolved itself of such responsibility, and simultaneously, how to think of climate reparations within Washington state, particularly in terms of historical debts to Native nations and tribes. But it is not just the distribution of emissions responsibility that matters. It also matters that those who are most affected by climate change from global to local scales have meaningful opportunities to participate in deliberations and decision-making about what to do about climate change. I know from my work in Nepal that climate solutions such as REDD+ have moved ahead in ways that did not heed principles of free, prior, and informed consent that in paper is considered very important, as Preston's presentation also highlighted. The right to informed consent is a participatory justice issue, just as adequate representation of typically underrepresented groups such as Indigenous people, women, and youth in policymaking and planning. In this regard, the very deliberate approach taken by the Washington Climate Assembly in ensuring equitable representation in the formulation of the Assembly is something I find quite admirable. This is an excellent procedural model to emulate in climate mitigation and adaptation planning, implementation, and evaluation. Another key element in environmental and climate justice conversations is that of recognition, the acknowledgement of communities who are particularly affected and underrepresented. In a global context, island nations and coastal and other communities whose food, water, livelihood security are severely threatened are often identified as those for whom climate change constitutes an existential crisis, not just in the future, but today. And in Washington state too, we have coastal populations, particularly the Quileute, Duwamish, Makah, Squaxin, Lummi, and other tribes whose vulnerability to sea level rise, tsunamis, as well as to threatened food sovereignty as a result of climate change needs to be recognized. Climate change is resulting in displacements around the world, with people being forced to move within and across international borders. Yet, there is no formal recognition of or resources earmarked for climate refugees. This is something Washington, as a progressive state, could plan ahead for as well. Alongside vulnerability, the traditional ecological and cultural knowledge systems and capabilities of both Native and immigrant BIPOC communities in understanding and responding to climate change should be recognized and validated, particularly when they depart from Eurocentric understandings of science and economics, and their self-determination powers to thwart fossil fuel and other harmful projects should be honored. And lastly, the image you see here on the top right corner is one you may have seen before, but I think it does a really good job of communicating two key ideas. One is that a one-size-fits-all solution is not equitable. So there is a need for equity-based solutions that do not presume an equal starting point for all communities. While equity in distribution and participation are important as starting points, eventually to have meaningful, long-lasting solutions, transformative justice solutions that examine root causes and offer structural solutions are necessary. Again, it is important to remember that people have different ideas about what the most important structural drivers of climate change are, although different political, economic, and social structures have historically intersected to produce the world we have inherited today. I believe there is no doubt that it is the way in which capitalism, colonialism, systemic racism, and patriarchal structures are deeply ingrained in our institutions and culture at large that form the foundational basis for the inequalities we see around us and experience at all scales. Because of these inequalities, people experience climate change in very different ways. But it is also true that these structures are also the root causes of the climate crisis itself. If you think about how these structures have made possible and normalized the scale of fossil fuel extraction and consumption. And it is the desire for capital accumulation for some that prevents the solution we know is necessary for mitigating the climate crisis most effectively, which is by divesting from the fossil fuel industry and making a concerted global effort to keep fossil fuels in the ground. But making the structural changes that are necessary to achieve transformative justice is not easy. Change does not occur overnight, but we can strive to move towards a world where all workers, but particularly the most exploited, can be fairly compensated for their labor, including household labor that is often not even recognized as the foundation for keeping our societies and economies going. A world where racial equality is the norm, and Indigenous people everywhere have sovereignty and self-determination over their land and territories, and where people can exercise control over the means of production that form the basis of their livelihoods. If all Indigenous people worldwide could exert self-determination over their territories, I doubt that we would continue to have a vibrant fossil fuel industry, the core problem in the climate crisis. If all Indigenous people worldwide could exert self-determination over the forests on which they depend, I doubt that forests that sequester carbon would be unsustainably cut down for profit. And although these two realms of nature, fossil fuels and forests, are super important sectors for climate mitigation efforts to target, and structural solutions could be conceptualized and implemented at the state level, I think that other sectors such as agriculture, urban planning, and economic development could also be restructured at the state level for climate mitigation benefits, as well as for adaptation. Next slide, please. The climate crisis is often described as a tragedy of the atmospheric commons. I think that's an interesting way to think about it, but the core idea behind it has a rather flawed history. Though the idea is much older, it was ecologist Garrett Hardin who, in a 1968 publication in Science, wrote about the tragedy of the commons as an inevitable phenomenon owing to the inevitably selfish nature of humans who seek to maximize individual gain at the cost of the common good. In what turned out to be a very influential article that has shaped environmental thinking for half a century now, he had said that the only way to avert such a tragedy is to either reduce human numbers, often at the cost of women's rights, or a centralized authority should, in a top-down manner, control the resource in order to protect it, described as the enclosure of the commons. But Hardin's biggest recommendation was that the best way to avoid a tragedy of the commons is to privatize the resource in question. We see this logic at play in the climate crisis, where the most widespread mitigation solution on offer is to buy and sell carbon credits, which has come about by commodifying the atmosphere. But carbon trade is not the best solution, even if the money that some countries such as Nepal are slated to receive in exchange for sequestering carbon in forests is welcomed by the government and forest-based communities there, even if it may not be a fair trade market. So there are distributive justice and participatory issues involved in carbon trade that commodifies the atmospheric commons. But Hardin had infamously declared that injustice was preferable to the ultimate tragedy. Other researchers, prominently Nobel Prize winning political economist Elinor Ostrom, had pointed to the biggest flaw in his argument, which was that he had no idea that in many parts of the world, people did not act selfishly to destroy their local commons, and that it is possible for members of a community to come together to create sustainable solutions without either privatizing the resource or imposing top-down centralized authority. The moral of the story here is that communities can be trusted to govern the resources on which they depend, utilizing their local and traditional knowledge if there are conducive circumstances and institutional validation of their governance, capability, and authority. Ostrom also argued that polycentric systems work best, where decentralized groups of resource users coordinate their efforts with a centralized authority. She noted the co-management system of Washington State's fisheries, created as a result of the Bolt decision, as a successful example of such a common pool governance structure. The Bolt decision has a foundation in treaties between the federal government and Native nations in Washington, but similar devolution of governance of resources may be conceptualized for other communities as well. Although the commons could be sustainably managed at the local scale through the formulation of rules and constraints created by the community, the atmospheric commons poses a problem in terms of collaboration and cooperation at the scale of the global community. It is not impossible. In the context of ozone thinning, the world did come together to create a successful and equitable mitigation plan at the international scale. The Kyoto Protocol attempted this for the climate crisis, but has failed in large part due to the bullying behavior of the US, which has insisted on acting as a free rider despite its tremendous responsibility. My hope is that the leadership of progressive states such as Washington may inspire for the rest of the country to act as a responsible and cooperative member of the global community. Next slide, please. Instead, the US has been a key promoter of neoliberal economic policies at home and around the world, understood as a form of slow violence because it promotes profit accumulation by dispossession. Numerous critical scholars have argued that the trend of neoliberalizing nature, by which is meant transforming open access resources and resources managed as a commons into private property, typically for profit-oriented pursuits, and the corresponding policy and institutional changes to accompany those pursuits through deregulation, commercialization, marketization, and commodification. So this pattern of nature's neoliberalization is actually the real tragedy of the commons, and that these patterns must be curtailed. It is not that markets are inherently bad. We need to buy things we cannot produce. But when the market is presumed to be the only or the best way to solve ecological problems, then there is a contradiction. If the pursuit of profits is what has caused the ecological crisis, then to think that we can dig our way out of the crisis through more of the same is deeply flawed, even if attempts are made to put a price on nature or ecosystem services. The ecological crisis and the climate crisis is more than a problem of market failure that can be fixed with economics. I think it is a moral and civilizational crisis. I think that the big battle of our time is one between forces that seek to commodify nature and those that strive to preserve the integrity and practice of the commons. Not everything should or can be bought or sold. While just compensation for labor is an important pursuit, where life and self-determination is at stake, communities can and should rise above market logics and create ground rules that seek to preserve the integrity of life. Next slide, please. My son helped me put together this slide as a way to visualize how the different commons are interconnected when we think about the climate crisis. I wanted to make an argument about how important it is that the global community cooperate to create fair and equitable rules to constrain greenhouse gas emissions to mitigate further climate change. Doing so is to treat the atmosphere as a commons rather than as an open access resource where any country can do as they please. The Paris Agreement is that kind of a treaty. So we have moved backwards from the Kyoto Protocol from the point of view of equity and also from an ecological standpoint. The Paris Agreement is neither fair nor ambitious and binding. We need to move towards a treaty that is like the Kyoto Protocol, but stronger, based on the best available science and moral stance. We cannot continue to tolerate US exceptionalism as demonstrated in climate treaty negotiations, as well as most recently, when the soon to expire US administration published an executive order on April 6, 2020, declaring that Americans should have the right to engage in commercial exploration, recovery, and use of resources in outer space. And the United States does not view it as global commons, end quote. This kind of blatant disregard for other members of a global community is in large part to blame for the exacerbation of the climate crisis. But even in the event that treating the atmosphere as a commons at the global scale has been challenging, I think there is hope for meaningful climate action because the climate system is connected to other spheres of life and resources, including forests, fossil fuels, water resources, land, and so on. So then if you agree that a practice of the commons is the right way forward for the most important spheres of life, then I think it is good news that it is possible to take back the commons at the local scale in these spheres, which are critical for climate mitigation, adaptation, or both. This may be an indirect but still effective way to mitigate effects on the atmosphere or to cope with the effects of climate change in ways that support distributive and participatory justice, recognize and validate the power of communities over the commons, the means of production, and thereby also make structural changes. This may not be possible or practical in all contexts, but I can share examples of contexts in which it has worked that I'm familiar with. My work in Nepal has helped me learn about community forestry, which is a commons-based system of governance where local forest-dependent communities have the power to govern forest resources that form the basis of their livelihood. This is an excellent example of communities taking back the commons from a centralized power, in this case, the Nepali government. This is not a perfect system, it has its flaws, but still a great example to learn from. Also in Nepal, an example very close to home for me comes from the Newar, who are the indigenous people of the Kathmandu Valley. They have a system called the Guti, which is a system of communal resource ownership and governance that has survived despite historical encroachments within a settler colonial-like context. One of the many ways in which the Guti manifests is through the preservation of traditional water spouts, considered critical for water security, particularly for the urban poor. In Washington State, shared governance between Washington State and Native tribes and nations is another example of taking back the commons, which I think is an example to emulate elsewhere as well. The importance of this for food security and food sovereignty and ecological sustainability more broadly is clear to see, such as with the Elwha Dam decommissioning project. Speaking of food security and sovereignty, I recently learned about what sounds like a fabulous program in the state of Maine, where an agrarian commons project and land trust has helped a Somali Bantu refugee community to acquire farmland that operates as a cooperative and enables a majority women farmers to make a living while practicing their traditional farming methods, including the Ishkashito model of cooperative sharing from back home for them in the Jaba River Valley in Somalia. Such agrarian commons are spreading to other states such as California and Montana, and I think would be a great way to support BIPOC farming communities in Washington as well. Recently, there was some news about how Bill Gates has acquired hundreds of thousands of acres of farmland across the United States, 16,000 acres in Washington state alone. I can think of no better way to put that kind of private property to use in service of climate adaptation and resilience than to emulate the practice of an agrarian commons for refugee and BIPOC farm workers in need. Other than forests, water resources, and food, the effects of climate change are felt in the form of weather events, so-called natural disasters. Naomi Klein and others have discussed patterns of disaster capitalism at play, where disaster response activities and resources are funneled to private contractors and how private property developers seize opportunities to acquire public lands following disasters. These patterns have been observed following Hurricane Katrina as well as in Nepal. The image here is of a wide expanse of public space in the center of Kathmandu, which has increasingly been targeted by private developers and the military, a classic case of enclosure and privatization of the commons. This area called Tunic Hill has served as a refuge for disaster-affected communities such as following the 2015 earthquake. In recent years, Kathmandu residents launched an Occupy Tunic Hill movement to take back that commons. But there is also another way in which you think about community resilience in the face of disaster. Rebecca Solnit, in A Paradise Built in Hell, recounts numerous examples of how ordinary people exercise cooperation and mutual aid and support networks following disasters, often working more effective than government authorities. What I want to suggest here is that Washington State would be wise to invest in an institutional structure of equitably representative communities configured at appropriate scales for resilience building efforts in preparation for disasters, rather than needing to rely solely on federal institutions such as FEMA. Although communities are capable of forming mutual aid networks on their own, federal and state resources earmarked for such eventualities would be wise and support those most likely to need support in times of crisis. Lastly, many of the solutions for climate change are conceptualized in the form of technological solutions such as solar and other renewable energies. Most green technologies are patent protected. In light of the severity of the climate crisis, as with the COVID crisis, we know that the availability of scientific, technological, public health solutions does not guarantee their accessibility to the most vulnerable and least economically resilient communities in the globe. There is an argument to be made for such knowledge that is vital for the sustenance of life when there are exceptional threats such as the ones we are faced with, to be brought into the domain of the public. India recently announced that it was going to purchase rights to hundreds of scientific peer-reviewed journals and make that information available free of charge to its citizens. In Germany, there are solar-powered utilities that are publicly owned. These are all examples of taking back the commons at certain scales that may be practiced at the level of Washington State. Next slide, please. So then what I'm arguing for is a structural solution to the climate crisis that entails the taking back of various commons by communities. If underrepresented BIPOC communities are recognized and empowered in this way, their access to and ownership of vital resources for livelihood, as well as governance and decision-making powers, would be enhanced. This makes them more resilient. This is one approach to decolonization that also supports distributive and participatory justice goals. I've tried to focus on Washington, but also want to emphasize that as a state in the most powerful country in the world, although it may not feel like it in the current moment, we should also push for accountability to those who are rendered vulnerable by actions within the US and in the wider world. Thank you very much.
Excellent, thank you so much. And we are going to move straight into our Q&A. And so we have taken down the PowerPoint and I've got the questions that folks have been addressing. If you have additional additional questions that you haven't yet had a chance to put in the chat, We did want to remind you that you can also text Wendy, and she put that number that you can text a question to just Assembly members using this as a way if the chat is not working for you. And yeah, thank you to our 3 presenters. And do you just want to take a moment to remind folks of one of the exercises we did at the inaugural meeting. It really great to have active chat, but just remind yourself that we all may have different opinions, but we all are working on the same issue, and just wanting to bring folks back to that. So the first question that we have for Georgine, presenter Georgine from Travis and Snohomish, are there reasons why some farms might not want to look at soil health as an option, such as financial limitations or negative impacts on yields? How do you get more farmers to look at soil health?
I guess I'll say, generally speaking, soil health supports yields over the long term. There are quite complicated ways that this plays out in terms of short term versus long term. Although, many farmers, in addition to running a business, hope to pass that business on to the next generation. So that is often a significant part of their consideration as well. I would say that so in some production systems, there's very clear that soil health also supports disease suppression. In other situations, it's much more complicated. So, making sure that you're supporting soil health, but limiting a number of complicated diseases can be a challenge. And also the way that this plays out, we know more about soil health, for example, in dryland wheat systems, I would say, than we do about perennial tree fruit systems. That the soil health questions there, as I understand it, are quite a bit more complex because of the way the crop happens. We also do see, many strategies that build soil health do in the short run have a negative economic impact or cost money. So for example, we know that recycling organic waste back and increasing carbon inputs into soils is one important way to build carbon, whether that carbon comes from compost or whether it comes from biochar or whether it comes from biosolids. But you have to pay to apply those, and they have to be transported. So both, I think there are some questions about exactly how and when to implement those systems and different soil health strategies together. But also there are places, I think, where more soil health building strategies would happen if they were supported financially. I have a colleague, somebody who's on our advisory committee actually, who farms in the Skagit, and she said that they used to provide a cost share for cover cropping seed, for example. I think it was through NRCS. And she said, at that time there were a lot more cover crops grown in the valley than you see currently because of that cost share.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Georgine. The next question comes from Javier from George, and this is a question for Preston. Do sovereign nations cross international lines? And Preston, you're
unmute. Okay. Yes, they do. In terms of the, federal obligations that they stop at the border. Although the tribes have consistently said we did not have those borders, and it's well understood, for example, the Salish cross into Canada, they used to be connected. Many of the Salish on the coast are still have family connections to those in British Columbia. So they're trying to reconnect those and get cross-border agreements to allow commerce. Actually, one of the things that the United States did try to do was to stop all commerce between the tribes, because in the early stages of the Republic, they were concerned that the tribes from Canada would come down and help foment crisis and invade the United States. So they actually prohibited it for a long time. We're trying to repair that. And those do create some pretty difficult questions, how to deal with the cross-border issues.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Preston. The next question comes from Robbie in Seattle, and this is to Shangri-La. What is a framework for ethically addressing emissions caused by corporations or industries that no longer exist but had a harmful effect on vulnerable populations?
Many environmental justice struggles use legal channels to make the polluter pay, and it's not always easy to do that, particularly in this kind of a situation. I think that the question is indicating. I think in terms of thinking about justice, the corrective justice notion of making the polluter pay is not the only way. When those avenues are not available, I think that it might be more productive to focus on the harmed community and making sure that, a community at the level of city, county, or state ensures that the most harmed, most vulnerable and victimized communities have resources set aside for them. So I think there are cases such as when the Bhopal gas disaster happened in India, and the companies that caused those, incidents, they absolve themselves of, responsibility or accountability by just, changing ownership. And I think that's one of the really difficult issues in which to achieve corrective justice. But when those options are not available, communities who have been harmed could still, could have access to resources to help cope with the consequences of such disasters, which I think would be an approach that might be ethical.
Excellent. Thank you so much. The next question comes from Sue from Medical Lake, and this is to Georgine. By food waste, I'm assuming you mean packaging, etc., or wasted food, if you can clarify that.
Sorry, I've usually seen those statistics expressed in terms of the organic waste, although you're correct, there is quite a bit of emission. And in that consumptive-based inventory, my suspicion is that that includes things like packaging or cups and that kind of thing as well. But when you see those statistics, it can range between 35 to 50% of the food we consume in this country is wasted. That's usually talking about the organic portion, the actual food itself, not the other waste associated.
Great. Thank you so much. The next question comes from Puneet from Sammamish, and this is also to you, Georgine. What would you rate as some of the most effective ways to reduce carbon emissions based on success in other countries?
I do not have a lot of experience with other countries in the world, so that's not my area of expertise. I will make the point that both British Columbia and California have efforts to reduce climate emissions. And so I think digging into those, I look to those two places, given that they're, somewhat similar to us in terms of size. California much larger than us in terms of the portion of the US economy it represents. So from that perspective, quite a bit different, but both of them having had some success. My understanding is that California to date has been more successful at changing their energy mix and reducing the emissions associated with their energy use, as well as they have some really interesting programs that have invested some of the profits from their cap and trade program, both in communities that are most likely to be affected by climate change and, for example, in soil health strategies related to agriculture. Sort of getting some benefit there or some carbon sequestration. I think my understanding is that they have been less successful to date at changing their transportation, reducing the emissions associated with their transportation sector, and that's really a challenge going forward for them. Not one without solutions, but more challenging so far. The one other thing actually I would say is that I think it was just last year, maybe 2 years ago, the Washington Academy of Sciences did hold a symposium on decarbonization of Washington's economy with a variety of scientific experts looking at different sectors. And I think I will add that to the additional reading list that I had given you guys and send you an updated one. I didn't include that before.
Excellent. Thank you so much. This next one is from Pedro in Bellingham. This is either to Georgine and or Preston. Do you think that Indigenous worldview is at last conjugating with scientific research? For instance, it has been, yeah, so I'll just leave it at that question. Do you want me to repeat the question?
I was going to let Preston take first stab at that.
Okay.
I understand the question. It's complicated.
Okay. And keeping our responses, recognizing these are complicated questions, as brief as possible in the interest of time. Preston, you're muted. Preston, sorry, you're muted still?
Okay, yeah, these will have to be cartoonish a little bit because of the short time. And but yes, there's a movement now to look at relational values, but from the Indigenous mind, they also look at what's called relational accountability. Accountability, is very important. That and again, as I said, that's not just to human beings, but you have accountability to your more than human entities and beings. And you have accountability to the land and to the waters and so on. So that that is starting to converge. And in my opinion, this is just a personal opinion, but many are reflecting it, something to consider. This is exactly what we need to get beyond the climate crisis, is that we really have to stop just exploiting mindlessly and without regard to the consequences of that, and understand that if we want to be here for the long term, if we want to be here in perpetuity, we really do have to take care of the earth, and we have to be mindful of the impacts on all sorts of things. So that's, and in terms of the science, yes, that I'm not connected, so this isn't a commercial plug, but I'm really excited. There's a new field guide coming out for Cascadia, and I would keep a watch for it, which includes Canada. That is organized by the Indigenous worldview. It's not the taxonomically oriented field guide, but what it does is it clusters things by their relationships among each other. So birds and trees and plants are clustered together because they are mutually dependent on one another. And it's that mutual interrelationships and mutual interdependence that we need to get to. And of course, there's lots of, that's one of my specialities. I work on traditional knowledge, and again, I can send some references that shows that Indigenous peoples, they may express it differently from science, but they do indeed know a lot about relationships, mutualisms, pollination, syndromes, all of these things, because they've lived on this landscape for over 800, 600, 800 generations, and they know how it works.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And just wanting to thank each of the presenters, Shangri-La, Georgine, and Preston. Thank you all so much for being here with us this morning. We recognize we have a lot more questions that we didn't have time to get to, but we have them all in a document that we'll be sending to each of the presenters that joined us this morning, and we'll be getting responses back to all of the Assembly members once we get those responses back. So with that, we are going to take a break, and we will reconvene at 12 p.m. on the dot. So try to get seated and get comfortable, and just a minute or two before that at 11:58. And starting at 12 p.m. on the dot, go grab anything you need, and please come back. We have some additional great presenters that want to talk to you all as well. So see you at 12. Excellent. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you were able to take a bit of a break, step away, not look at a screen for a couple minutes as we dive into part 2 of our presentations. We've got a few presenters here during this last hour that we'll be hearing from, and just reminding the presenters to please keep your time to the time allotted, just so that we've got time to cover all the things that need to be covered across our presenters. And yeah, welcome back. With that, I'm going to go ahead and just launch right back in and introduce our next set of speakers here. We will be hearing from Howard Scharfstein, as well as Steve Hollandhorst, who will be presenting on creating a carbon conservation trust movement. And this is a really good reminder too, if you aren't a presenter, if you would go ahead and just check your mute and make sure that you're muted, and encouraging folks to keep their videos on if you'd like to, but obviously not mandatory either. So up to you for your comfort level. Both Howard and Steve. So Howard, welcome. Howard is a retired environmental attorney and former corporate sustainability leader. For more than 4 decades, Howard has been an environmental professional serving in policy, technical, and legal roles. Howard has been an adjunct professor here at Western since early 2019, and he's taught both environmental law and policy, as well as energy policy and politics. Howard is currently leading an independent study program for students to help launch the Carbon Trust movement. And I know you're splitting your time with Steve, so I'll quickly introduce Steve as well. Steve Hollandhorst is a professor and dean of the Huxley College of the Environment at Western Washington University. Prior to that, he was the Associate Dean of the College of Natural Resources at the University of Idaho, founding director of UI's award-winning Building Sustainable Communities initiatives. So welcome to both of you. Thank you all so much for being here. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Howard.
Actually, it's Steve here, and I'll get us started by sharing my screen.
Excellent. Thank you, Steve.
Let's see if it comes up. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
We're good.
Yes.
Okay. All right. I'll get us started. I'll talk about the first few slides here. Then Howard will talk about the mechanics and logistics of how we see such a movement taking off, and then I'll say a few concluding words. The talk we're giving today is based on the white paper we wrote, Creating a Carbon Trust Movement, which you can access at the Climate Assembly website. And also we've prepared an executive summary with a few slides for you that will be there. And in that paper, what we argue is that it's time for us that if we really want to make progress on climate change, we need to rethink our relationship with carbon, much like we've done with the rest of the natural world. And that evolution of thinking has brought us from looking at the natural world purely in terms of utilitarian direct use values like trees for lumber, animals for food, rivers for hydropower, the kind of commodification that Shangri-La talked about, towards seeing it and conserving the many ecosystem services that nature provides. And in fact, what we've done in this country is we've created an extensive system of public policies using the polycentric types of methods that Shangri-La talked about, Ostrom's ideas of that include not only regulation, but a vast protected area network system to conserve those ecosystem service values. Part of that system includes a private nonprofit conservation system. Imagine the Nature Conservancy and the land trust system across the country, with thousands of land trusts doing that kind of work that use fee simple ownership and legal commitments to like conservation easements to protect those ecosystem values. Well, our proposition here is we need to extend that thinking to carbon conservation. We need to view our carbon inheritance accumulated over millions of years as an immense carbon reserve that regulates atmospheric carbon levels and thus deserves the same conservation and protection that we extend to other parts of the natural world. We need to flip our thinking from a focus solely on trying to regulate or prohibit those carbon emissions, and also think about something we can do without the political consensus that requires, and that is to safeguard the carbon reserves from which those emissions come from, right? And we can start doing that today without a political consensus. The alternative title we could use for this talk today, borrowing from Dr. Strangelove, is How to Stop Worrying and Love Carbon, or even more provocatively, Buy Carbon Now, right? So that's the basic idea we want to talk over with you. Okay, next slide. So the basic problem we all know is that climate change results from the global economy moving vast quantities of carbon in the form of greenhouse gases from the lithosphere, the Earth's crust, and the pedosphere, the soil, and the biosphere, living organisms, into the atmosphere, the air, and the hydrosphere, water, right? And we have a whole socioeconomic system that does not value the climate stabilizing value that carbon reserves provide us, whether they're in the ground or whether they're in living things. Nor do they account for the externalities when we emit those carbon reserves into the atmosphere. And we know what we need to do here. It's simple. We need to stop digging, and we need to quit emitting that carbon that we dig. And we need to start restoring the Earth's carbon reserves in order to reduce the carbon that's currently in the atmosphere. Yet we've not been able to create the political consensus that's required to take public policy action. So what we propose here is an approach that doesn't require that political consensus. The basic idea is that we want to create a system of nonprofit, community-based entities that we call carbon conservation trusts, or CCTs, that take action both to protect existing carbon reserves and to capture and sequester additional carbon that's already out in the atmosphere and in the oceans. So imagine using legal agreements like conservation easements to acquire and safeguard carbon. And as a result of that, imagine a system of subterranean carbon protection areas, analogous to, say, a national park or a nature preserve that safeguards those reserves with those agreements. Imagine agricultural land where carbon farming becomes an additional product to grow and sell by those farmers. Imagine wildlands where recapturing carbon becomes one of the primary conservation goals of those wildland areas. And imagine robust markets where offset buyers who need to mitigate, who need to pay reparations for their carbon emissions can purchase carbon credits from those carbon owners. All right. So the work of a CCT will be determined by the bioregion in which they exist. So for instance, here in our region where we have rich biogenic carbon reserves in the form of our forests and nearshore riparian areas, wetlands, grasslands, that kind of thing, emphasis would be on restoring those landscapes as carbon refugia. In agricultural regions, attention would focus more on farming and agroforestry practices that capture and sequester farming. And in fossil fuel country, the focus would be on securing those fossil carbon reserves, what we call lithospheric carbon reserves, and making sure that they stay in the ground, right? So what this basic idea here is, it picks up where government action or where political consensus leaves off. And it creates a sort of a political an institutional framework, organizational design, and a finance system based on current law and creative use of markets to secure and capture and safeguard carbon. We don't need to wait for political solution to regulate carbon or technological solutions to replace it or recapture it. We can start doing this work right now. We think this is an attractive approach because for conservatives, they will appreciate it as an alternative to a traditional government intervention approach that involves regulation, taxation, that sort of thing. Progressives, we think, will like this idea because it will multiply the impact of government-led efforts to regulate carbon emissions. And in either case, we don't have to wait for that political consensus to be successful. All we need is just to be innovative, to use carbon markets, to use existing legal mechanisms, and grow this carbon trust movement. We can start right now. And all we have to do is look at carbon with new eyes and use the tools that we already have at our disposal. So with that, I'll turn things over to Howard to talk about how the system would work. Howard.
Well, thanks, Steve. And I'm going to answer the question, how do we plan to take the Carbon Conservation Trust from this ecological concept to an implementation strategy? First, we start with the foundation of markets, law, and labor. Then we build upon pillars that others have already put in place. For example, this is inspired by the land trust movement. We look to workforce development programs, landowner outreach akin to what the Cooperative Extension and Soil Conservation Service do now, and will develop sources of patient capital. Next, we build alliances with people and organizations having strong know-how and proven methods for working on securing legal rights to carbon reserves, implementing selected project drawdown solutions, measuring and verifying carbon exchange, capture and sequestration, and engaging smartly in carbon markets. Next, how do we go from strategy to action? The answer is by mobilizing young people. Starting this month, we are sharing our vision for Carbon Trust with several student interns and a couple of graduate fellows who will help us launch the Carbon Conservation Trust movement. We will ask these young people to help us imagine teams of climate care workers engaging with property owners to protect and place their existing carbon reserves and promote land management practices that capture and sequester additional carbon while producing nourishing food and increasing the resiliency and profitability of their land holdings. Next, what principles will guide the organizational design of the CCT movement?
Oh, sorry about that. I'm having a hard time advancing. There we go.
Okay. The principles that will strive to promote are collaboration, responsibility, and rapid scalability. Community-based local carbon conservation trusts are at the heart of this effort. Carbon trusts will be supported by a national association we'll call the ACCT, which will be responsible for convening, governance, accreditation, standard setting, education, and training. Then the CCTs, the carbon trusts themselves, will provide leadership and administration while overseeing measurement, documentation, finance, supply chain, team building, and stakeholder engagement. The workforce will be the comparative advantage. These boots on the ground will engage in the work of tree planting, regenerative agriculture, protecting lithosphere carbon, and engaging in carbon markets. Next, How do we think about turning these capabilities into solutions? First, we consider the appropriate level at which the work can be done efficiently. For example, at the high level of the ACCT, at the empowered local carbon trusts, or through the climate care workforce directly. Then we ascertain whether the work constitutes a core competency of the CCT movement. If so, we engage experts to build the capability internally and share know-how throughout our movement. If not, we identify others in the field and network with leading practitioners to form alliances. We then develop systems for sharing best practices so that the CCT network can continuously improve its performance and strengthen our alliances. Finally, we look for opportunities to expand our capabilities and our reach by entering additional phases of the carbon farming effort. Next slide. A guiding principle of the CCT movement will be to follow the data where it leads. We intend to train ourselves and each other to ask the question, where is the next best opportunity to protect carbon reserves or capture and sequester additional carbon? The CCT dashboard will make visible our progress. The 4 key measures are emission reductions resulting from our work, the amount of carbon dioxide equivalent we have sequestered, the number of jobs created, and the monetary value of the carbon credits linked to our efforts. Next slide. While the dashboard will focus on just 4 metrics, our management system will keep a close eye on shared values to make sure we hold ourselves accountable for achieving larger virtues. We want to be a workplace of choice where people come for a fulfilling short-term opportunity or pursue a professional career in climate care. Our focus will be on carbon, but the work is all about building climate resiliency and creating additional ecosystem service benefits. We will strive to work cooperatively with landowners in support of sustainable economic models. We recognize the challenge of fostering climate justice. We've heard some great presentations on that today, and we'll set priorities so that resources are invested in restorative work. To do all this, we envision a youth-driven, diverse, and inclusive community of practice. While such aspirational goals are not easily measured, we will challenge ourselves to track progress toward fulfilling these intentions and values. Next slide. Well, where do we go from here? We start by engaging thought leaders to give us a reality check on our ideas. We make many assumptions, we have theories that we want to apply into practice, but most of all, we want thought leaders to help us refine a strategic plan that gets us to implementation and scaling. We will be seeking grant funding to launch a pilot carbon trust here in Whatcom and in Skagit counties. Based on early results from the inaugural Carbon Trust, we will convene a founders conference to establish an ACCT network, perhaps in a year. Along the way, we will be recruiting advisory board members to help us inform our carbon protector field teams with guiding principles, best practices, and training materials. Finally, and fundamentally, once we've demonstrated proof of concept, we want the CCT model to be rapidly scalable so that communities everywhere can adapt the CCT framework to their bioregion and local economies. How can you get involved? I'll let Steve address that.
So this is our last slide. And just a reminder that to read about this concept more in detail, you can access the white paper or the executive summary we put together at the Assembly website. So will you work with us on this idea? Does this sound interesting to you? We have 4 ways that we're sort of suggesting that maybe you could connect with the CCT concept and how we can advance it. The first is to support the idea as part of the Assembly's work. Another is to join us as an advisor and bring your expertise in whatever realm it is to the idea. And we are really interested in what some of those ideas are. We recognize that we come at this from a pretty narrow perspective ourselves. We'd love to see your interest in serving on the advisory boards, and then join us when the time comes to attend a founders conference. I hope that you can see, Howard and I both hope that you can see that there's a real parallel here with the land trust movement and how it emerged in the United States in the 60s and 70s, and the work it's done since then. And the last thing that we plan to do, and your help on it would be interesting, would be to go to the Northwest Land Cut Camp this summer and present a virtual workshop opportunity on that, because we think the overlap with the land trust community and the type of work they're doing is pretty rich. And we're going to introduce the idea to that community there. So you can contact us at this information here. If you have trouble getting the paper, we're happy to send it to you. And we look forward to hearing your ideas about the concept. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Howard and Steve, for your presentation. And before we move to our next presentation, we're going to pause for about 30 seconds, taking a breath, standing up if you need to, shoulder rolls, head rolls, whatever you need to do. Okay, and with that, I will be introducing Christy Carey, Freddie Lane, and Mark Washke. Let me know if I'm mispronouncing that, Mark, and apologies if I am, presenting on climate change and human well-being. Quick intros to these 3 presenters who will be co-presenting together. Christy is currently an organizer and active member of Extinction Rebellion out of Bellingham. This group attempts to educate the public about climate-related issues through social media and events. And in her professional life, she works with a main focus on students and youth. Freddie is a documentary filmmaker and photographer who graduated from Chemawa Indian Boarding School in 1986. He is a former member of the Lummi Council and advocates for treaty rights, rights of nature, and environmental protectionism. And the third speaker in this group, Mark, was raised on a working dairy in Western Washington and has operated a tree trimming business for over 40 years. Mark has been an activist starting with the Occupy movement as participant and organizer, and now a volunteer activist with Extinction Rebellion. And with that, I will turn it over to Christy, Freddie, and Mark.
Hello, I'm hoping you can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you.
Excellent. So we are going to bring all of the concepts that have been spoken about home to you so that you can implement things in your own life that will be relevant to everything that was just said. So if you could go to the next slide. The question we were posed is, how can Washington State equitably design and implement climate mitigation strategies while strengthening communities disproportionately impacted by climate change across the state? So right now I'm going to introduce Sulkadup, which is Freddie Lane's given name, and it will then go to Mark Washke and then to myself. And the themes that you have heard from all the previous presenters, you will be able to implement in your own life at some level. Okay, Sulkadup, it's your turn.
Now siam nostalgia. So hila konisana tacho ti kaya siam nostalgia. So Caleb Sanasnat. It is true, my heart is glad to be here with each and every one of you. on this historic day in these unprecedented times. We don't have to look far. I look right down here at Lummi Shore. And if you ever get the chance to come out to Lummi and drive around what we call the Horn, the big peninsula here, you could see the king tides come all the way up to our beaches. We have no more beaches out here. So if you want to see climate change in action, on the move, you can come out to the reservation and see it, or probably see it in your own front yards. Shisheshwawalik, Shisheshwawalik, Shisheshwawalik. I am a survivor of the Great Flood. Shisheshwawalik. This past year, we lost our beloved chief, who always reminded me to always remind people where you come from. I do not speak the language, but I'm a lifelong resident of Lummi Nation. I'm so honored to be sitting with this distinguished group of community leaders and scholars and just all out. I call you guys the Earth Keepers, and that's where you know, we as Indigenous people have been struggling. You see Standing Rock. You see the Indigenous of South America in Brazil trying to save their homelands. And so I'm just going to break all the news to you. I lost my re-election on October 31st here at Lummi Nation. But, you know, leadership isn't a position or title. It's an act or an example. And as a community leader, which most of you, those of you that know me, community leadership is real powerful. And I just wanted to offer Steve and Howard, you know, just hearing your good work across the bay here. And I'd love to help you. I'd love to sit on your advisory board and continue this. I'm here representing me and my family, the Lane family. My relatives, I'm of the Eagle clan. I don't speak on behalf of the nation, but I speak for many of those who are entrusted to the nation, the salmon, the four-legged, those that crawl the earth, those that fly the skies. These are our relatives. This is our connection. And I know I'm supposed to have 6 minutes, and I will do my best to keep it down to 120 seconds here in the next few moments. But, you know, how can we help the state equitably design and implement climate mitigation? Well, what I'm doing, and anybody can do this. Any single one of you can do this. I started this a month ago with our friends at the Universalists, the Unitarians here in Bellingham. And all of a sudden, through the workshop, there were three of us: an environmental attorney, an environmentalist, and little old Indian me. And what we started was the rights of nature in recognizing the Nooksack River as a being, as an entity, as a person, not just as some river that provides the greater Bellingham Bay Area and Whatcom County water. It is a living being. And just with the great work, we're meeting filmmakers, we're meeting environmentalists, we're meeting, I met this week with two attorneys. It gives me chills just seeing right now what just the few of us are doing. But, you know, some of the talk that's come out was recognizing all of our rivers in Washington state give what? Life. It's about life. And corporations, I have to say, are people too. They are citizens united and recognized. Corporations don't have hearts. They don't have souls. They don't have, they think nothing of themselves but greed and the bottom line. And you know, I'm just want to say that, you know who you're up against. Here at Lummi Nation, we fought SSA Marine to protect Quechican. Why? It wasn't because that they were going to, oh, we just want to, we're not going to disturb your burial grounds there at Cherry Point. We just want to put 55,000 tons of coal on top of your ancestors. And so, our ability to look at what's happening around the world, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. What is great right now with what we're doing in our little effort, in my little part as a Eagle Clan member and as a former tribal leader, is I'm utilizing the tactics that I have, the skills, the graphic, the filmmaking, every skill that I have to help create this work and recognize our relative, the Nooksack River, the old Lummi River that brings salmon to our people, that brings water to the four-legged up in the mountains, that helps provide the cleanliness of Bellingham Bay in the northern Salish Sea. And so the Maori people have done this. We're following in their footsteps. The Maori, you may have heard of the Klamath River in Southern Oregon and Northern California, so and my goal, I hope what would be great is to go to the Earth Law Center's website, and they're really helping us. They're helping us out with resolutions, communicating to county councils, to creating these templates. And that's the goal, is to create a template. So, grandma and grandpa Doe, the so-and-so river would like to start this campaign. It doesn't take a great deal of, what we're doing is we're starting small. Treaty rights are only one aspect of, what our treaties with the United States government, not with the Washington Territory. And so, what I encourage a lot of people to do, just like what the professors were talking about, Steve and Howard previously speaking, and thinking about doing a summit. We have 2 years, think about it. We're going to have Deb Holland, the first American Indian to ever serve in a cabinet level position with the President of the United States as Department of Interior Secretary. We have 2 years, okay? So imagine what kind of policy that you would like to impose. Why don't we protect Bears Ears forever? Why don't we protect the Columbia River forever? Why don't we protect the Mississippi forever? What is stopping us is the bureaucracy and these climate deniers. And I think I've spoken. I feel free to reach out to me. I just encourage anyone that would like help. I'm a problem solver. I wish out of this too that we would put together a real awesome think tank, because that's what I like to do. I like to think problems out and what are the solutions. If we could talk about the problem for so long, for 30 minutes, let's talk about the solutions and bring good minds together and bring strategists, Republicans, Democrats, independents, to bring the corporate world in that's recognizing the good work that we're all doing. And again, my heart, I just appreciate each and every one of you. My love from Lummi Nation, our elders, our veterans, my friends and family here, and just really applaud your important work that each and every one of you are doing in following these great footsteps that are already laid out for each and every one of you. And with that, I yield the remainder of my time to Christy and Mark. Haiska, thank you.
Hi, Aishka. I'm with XR Bellingham, and this is an international movement that was started in the UK in 2017 with 3 core demands. First, to be carbon neutral by 2025. Second, for the media to tell the truth about the climate situation and just how dire it is. And third, for to have a national citizens assembly to implement the changes, because the governments and the corporations are just not doing it. Now, what the Green Recovery Act, the UK has just come up with, it's a new 9-step proposed, it's proposed to cut carbon emissions to 0 and guarantee full employment, the FIT, incomes, full employment, incomes and training, you know, as the guarantee. But now, okay, go again.
And Mark, just a quick reminder, we have about 10 minutes for your full group. So we just have time for just a couple minutes from you. And then we'll be connecting with Christy offline as well. So go ahead, Mark, couple minutes left.
Oh dear. Okay, well, the elephant in the room, so although I probably won't get to most of what I wanted to say, the elephant in the room, I did want to bring up and throw it out there. You know, the media must tell the truth. That has been the biggest failing that we've had in getting the word out there with what is going on. And even though this isn't specifically part of this, you know, the statewide thing, the US military is the biggest global carbon emitter. And that's something we all need to be aware of. And as it was already talked about why we're in the situation we have, is the commoditization of the planet that's already been talked about, and that we belong to the earth. It does not belong to us. Now, this is the tree planting in challenging areas like Eastern Washington, around Oroville, and you know what I'm talking about here. I did 120 tree thing, and the person's property we're planting them on was going to have to be watering every one of those trees every week during the summer for 2 years to make them live. You have tree planting projects where they plant millions of trees all around the world. And my question is, what is the 5-year survival rate of those trees? Because that's really important there. Now also on a worldwide, you know, I wanted to go to a worldwide scale and then bring it back to a personal scale, and then our statewide thing as well. It's interesting to note that Denmark has 95% of their legislators signed on. They have multiple parties. 95% of the legislators has signed on to their climate mitigation plans. So it can be done. Bhutan is the only country who is currently carbon negative. Okay, next slide. Okay, the soil amending and the permaculture. This is something I'm doing personally. This should be done through one of our links is the Snohomish. God, I'm just trying to rush this through. This is something people can do themselves too.
And can I say too that at the bottom of this slide is a link to show, he actually made a video that I recorded of him doing it here in our garden. So people can do this at their own home in their own gardens.
It's a 5-year project of replacing the clay with logs down at the bottom of over a 3-foot thing. Okay, next slide. The natural resources conservation, that's already been mentioned here today, and now that does go nationwide, and that allows you in areas, you know, like Eastern Washington, where the area where I was doing 3 miles away, there was a forest. Everything I was looking out at, which was you know, probably 30 to 40 miles you can see around there, is totally grasslands. It would be expensive to do, but that's something that would pay for 7 generations. Okay, go on ahead then.
And we have final minute for you, Mark, and then we are going to move on to our final presenter, Jennifer Atkinson.
Oh, let Christy have this last minute, please.
Can you just move it forward to, and then we'll go as fast. We can do this in a minute. I'm good at this sort of thing. Okay, go past
You're
that.
off the screen if you want to move the computer in front of you or speak up a bit.
Oh, okay, I will speak up. Okay, so what mainly I want to say that the cities, the counties should change coding so that we are allowed to have energy efficient homes and septic systems and gardening and water catchment systems. They need to help us. Okay, you can go to the next one. Bellingham is an example. Inslee has a great plan. That is public knowledge. You can look it up on his site, on the state site. It's well worth reading. He's already moving the ball quite forward. Okay, next slide. Keep going. Tiny homes is where I was going with that. They will have their own garden area, their own porches. They'll have a small, talking about intentional communities, it'll be a congregate sort of garden where everyone can grow their own things, and low flow toilets and LED. Okay, you can go to the next slide. That's just a picture. You can go to the next slide. And the Department of Ecology, the plastic. Okay, that's my key thing I want to mention here quickly. If you can go one more slide. That's what our ocean looks like right out here, right off our coast. That is destroying all environment inside that exists in there, as well as our own reproductive status. So if you go one more slide, this is a fetus, a human fetus with plastic that isn't now being seen in placentas. And so we are now affecting the human race, and the people who have the least access to healthcare are going to be the most impacted. One more. I'm going to bring up AmeriCorps, and then that's all I really need to say. AmeriCorps is the answer to Howard and Stephen's plan, because AmeriCorps is already up and running, has the funding, does huge environmental work all over the country. It is in every county of Washington. You get a stipend for being involved. Half of the money is given to you directly. Half of it is banked for you for educational reasons. It would encourage people who have no idea that they could have any kind of education to earn money as they get to pay for their education, as well as doing wonderful things for the earth. You can go one more. I might have been, that's just a picture.
Yeah, final thought here, Christy.
Okay, so the infrastructure that those to do with their carbon plan is already there. All we need to do with the folks who presented today is collaborate, and we could actually get this going on a personal level, all the way to the micro system, all the way to the macro system, and not wait until governments do what they're supposed to do. And I can stop there. And I have great resources at the end of this. So if you post this document, they can look up all of these things.
Thank you, Gretchen, and thank you to the Washington Climate Assembly and everybody that is online here and watching, and just really appreciate the conversation. I just want to raise my hands to you and Gretchen and all your team and their good work that you're doing right now.
Great. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Christy, Freddie, and Mark for sharing some words. With that, we are going to pause for just 30 seconds before we move into our final presenter for the day. We have Jennifer a little bit less time. I just want to let you be aware of that. So we've got about 14 minutes for you to present. So if you can adjust your talking points accordingly, we are ending right at 1 o'clock today.
Okay. Just want to make sure you can see my screen.
Great. And I'll do a quick introduction, Jennifer. Jennifer Atkinson is an associate professor of environmental humanities at the University of Washington in Bothell. Thank you so much for joining us, Jennifer, and welcome.
Thank you so much. So I was invited today to talk about climate anxiety and eco grief. the sense of doom and despair that's really been growing as we face these alarming projections about our future. So I think this is less directly about policy and more about the existential dimensions, but I think that they very much inform each other. We really, usually focus on the physical aspects of the climate crisis. But of course, this issue is also taking a huge emotional and psychological toll. And I first got involved in this topic after seeing my students at the University of Washington fall into despair. On this slide are some quotes from the first day of one of my classes when I asked them how they felt about the future. And these are young people telling me that they don't want to have children because the future seems so grim, or they have trouble sleeping at night because their minds are playing out scenes of social breakdown and mass extinction. But it's not just students. The American Psychological Association put out a major report in 2017 documenting climate disruption as a mental health crisis. The term eco-anxiety even made the shortlist for Oxford's Word of the Year in 2019. And this awareness is even slowly starting to creep in and change the way that news outlets report on climate disasters, with more of them now highlighting the psychological effects. I think coverage really ramped up last year with reports coming out of Australia of a mental health crisis in the wake of the bushfires. But this is not at all new, just because the media is finally kind of catching on. So what is climate or eco-anxiety? These terms are used for an array of emotions, so it's important not to define them too narrowly. The APA defines eco-anxiety as a chronic fear of environmental doom, and they profile a range of symptoms. But eco-anxiety really, it's taken off in such a way that it's become a catch-all term for a range of emotions, not just anxiety, but grief, shame, anger, fear, hopelessness. I think I really like this definition. This is from Britt Ray. She looked at the APA's official definition and then just summarized it in these words. She said, at this late stage in the climate crisis, it is merely a sign of attachment to the world. In terms of who is impacted, frontline communities are experiencing the brunt of climate disruption and the most direct harm. As always, it's the poor and overwhelmingly Black, Indigenous, and communities of color who are suffering the worst emotional toll because they're experiencing the heaviest impacts. Hurricane Katrina is always used as a classic example here, simply because it's so extensively researched. The APA report showed that 1 in 6 people impacted met the diagnosis for PTSD, and suicide or suicidal thoughts more than doubled for displaced people in New Orleans. But you see this following every climate disaster. And that toll on mental health really isn't surprising, since Black and brown and low-income communities who don't have equal access to resources to protect themselves also lack access to mental health services, on top of housing and emergency services and everything else. So all of that makes it harder to recover from climate disasters. And then for many Indigenous people, warming climate, as I'm sure you heard earlier today, is wiping out traditional hunting and cultural practices. One really visible example of this that gets cited a lot is in the Arctic, where communities can't travel to ancestral sites because the landscape is melting beneath them. But in Washington state, it's manifesting around the huge decline in salmon from rising temperatures in our rivers. And with something that's so integral to cultural identity, of course, that also has an immense psychological and mental impact, which is really just the last chapter in a long history of colonialism and racism, which means that climate injustice is only magnifying these past traumas. But it's also important to keep in mind that a person doesn't have to live through a full-blown climate disaster to experience eco-grief. Scientists as a group suffer some of the highest rates of depression, since they're the ones that are running these terrifying projections about the future. And of course, many of those people go into this field because they love their whatever it is they're studying, whether it's forests or coral reefs or species of wildlife. So it's not surprising that they experience trauma from watching the death and disappearance of their life's work. But one of the, I think the problems there is that scientists are in a very unique position that makes it harder to cope with emotional aspects because their field puts so much emphasis on objectivity and detachment. There is a stigma around discussing subjective and emotional responses, which means that many scientists are concerned about compromising their professional credibility by appearing too emotional. And that reluctance to talk about this issue is something I want to come back to at the end. And then finally, you know, the general public is also reporting increasing levels of distress around climate change. And that's because everybody's daily life is changing in 1,000 subtle ways. And here I'm talking about the more slow moving changes like the loss of bees and songbirds, those annual fishing trips where you come back with less and less every year, or the number of days you can't go outside or see the stars because of the wildfire smoke. All of that adds up to a very deep and personal sense of loss. This is what Glenn Albrecht calls solastalgia, and he's playing on the concept of nostalgia, which is a longing for a time or a place that you can't go back to. But solastalgia happens while you're still at home. So it's the pain of watching your surroundings become unfamiliar. He defines the condition as a homesickness experienced without ever leaving home. Oops. So as I move to the second half here, I want to acknowledge that there's both a dark side to climate anxiety and grief and a mobilizing potential beneath these emotions. Above all, I recognize how valid these feelings are. And especially when a person spends decades repressing this pain, those feelings can really spiral out of control or lead to despair and helplessness and inaction. To be honest, what I think we're seeing now is what happens in a culture of repression here in the West when things finally come boiling out. Many people who work on climate issues, myself included, will tell you that just a decade ago, it felt like very few people were paying attention. The news was ignoring the issue, and much of our energy was just going towards convincing people that climate change was real. And then things shifted very quickly, with public belief in climate change increasing alongside media coverage in just the last few years, but with a very strong emphasis now on apocalyptic outcomes. And we have all seen these headlines saying we're screwed, it's game over for the planet, decarbonize in 10 years or face the total collapse of civilization. I want to say that headlines like these are dangerous because many people assume it's already too late and there's nothing we can do, which is not true. And research is also increasingly finding that being motivated by fear-centered headlines, people are immobilized by despair. It doesn't inspire people to take action. And I'm personally most concerned about the effects on young people. At its most extreme, this can feed what are already growing rates of severe depression and anxiety and even suicide. And of course, there are many other stressors young people are dealing with beneath those trends, but climate is emerging as one of the big issues feeding their despair. So how do we channel this anxiety more productively? Because of the time limit, I can only briefly touch on this. So if you want to take a deeper dive into the strategies, I invite you to check out my podcast, Facing It. And I've kept the episodes very short. They're 15 minutes each to really explore how grief might actually be a valuable resource for us to harness in the fight for climate justice. So I'm just going to highlight 2 or 3 and let me know when I'm out of time here. Number one of the most powerful places to start is simply acknowledge and make place for these feelings and for the discussions in your climate work. I've already mentioned the stigma around openly expressing emotional responses within the scientific community and how that exacerbates depression. But one of the reasons for this silence is that our culture doesn't really have any socially recognized norms for mourning the loss of non-human lives. Of course, I'm talking about kind of Western culture here. When a fellow human dies, we have rituals and traditions that can help us process that loss, like funerals and memorials and vigils, or support groups or therapists who specialize in bereavement. But if we feel grief for the death of 3 billion animals in the Australian bushfires, or another lost glacier, or the biodiversity crisis, there are very few social structures that validate or support us in that pain. And until very recently, we didn't even have a language to talk about this, at least in English. When there's no name for something, it's really hard to recognize that it exists. And that gives rise to what researchers call disenfranchised grief. This is a loss that is personally experienced but can't be publicly acknowledged or openly mourned. And that invisibility and lack of legitimacy compounds the pain that is experienced. So simply making a space for those conversations is more powerful than we might think, because it's part of the larger work of culture shift. I also want to say that we tend to think of grief as privatizing, as a state that makes us retreat and turn inward, but public expressions of grief can also be a political act. And that actually might be the difference between grief and mourning, especially collective or public mourning, which are outward expressions. We live in a culture where some lives matter and others don't. Some deaths receive elaborate tributes and mourning rituals, while others are trivialized or ignored. And of course, groups like Black Lives Matter, people seeking injustice for murdered Indigenous women and trans and homeless and LGBTQ activists know firsthand how the absence of grief dehumanizes them, which is why they deliberately use public protests and vigils to ensure that those deaths aren't pushed into the shadows. And that refusal to protect ourselves from the pain of witnessing other species' death, in this case, is an act that scholars identify as resistant mourning, which consciously chooses to hold on to feelings of pain and grief to spur a sense of responsibility. And then the last point that I'll share, we need to completely reframe the way we think about grief if we want to succeed in harnessing it towards climate solutions and meaningful action. I've been really concerned about the tendency to pathologize these feelings of sadness or anxiety as a disorder. That needs to be rejected, because framing climate anxiety as a mental illness locates the problem in the individual instead of the social structure. So rather than thinking of it as a dysfunction, I encourage my students and other activists to understand their eco-anxiety as a moral emotion. It's a response that arises from an accurate assessment of the situation and a sense of compassion and desire for justice. I always remind my students, you will not grieve for something you don't love. And I'm by no means the first person to say this. I think this is captured beautifully in the words of Jiddu Krishnamurti. It is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. Martin Luther King Jr. also famously said that the salvation of the world lies in the hands of the maladjusted. And in a recent episode of my podcast, I even suggested that we might think of climate anxiety as a kind of superpower, as a signal that goes off to tell us something's wrong and needs to be addressed, even while others seem to be sleepwalking through the crisis because their alarm isn't tuned as well. So one thing that I do in my classes is guide students through activities where we talk openly about each of these emotional responses. And as we share something like fear or anger or grief, we listen with compassion to each other, but always end by helping the other person recognize those feelings as moral emotions and acknowledge the strength that they can bring to climate work. So I mentioned that grief is a function of love and compassion. We also recognize how anger and outrage arise from a desire for justice. When a person shares something they fear about the future, that shows trust and courage, and a courage to speak openly. Okay, so I think we've just about run out of time here. My last point was going to be about the stories we tell, that we need different stories. But I will go ahead and conclude there. I did include my social media information where I post new talks and workshops and podcast episodes. So please, I'll go ahead and drop this in the chat, or you might already have this with your resources. So Gretchen, I don't know if you want to have time for any questions, or if that's it and we need to let people go. Our time here.
So just a couple of process things. First, just want to thank you, Howard, Steve, thank you, Christy, Freddie, Mark, and thank you so much, Jennifer, for all being here for the second half. And obviously we had presenters at the first half as well. And just thanking all the presenters that came today. And turning it back over to the Assembly members, we can go ahead and stop sharing the screen if that's okay. And we have 1 minute left. And in that minute, I just want to do a quick kind of process standpoint. We we're short on time today, which wanting to just acknowledge that. Moving forward, we will be working with each of the presenters and then actually enforcing kind of a time cap. So looking at the experts and also introducing presenters as experts or interested parties, because there is a different time allotment for each of those categories. It's 10 to 20 minutes for experts and it's 6 to 8 minutes for interested parties. So we will be, as we move forward, we'll be enforcing kind of those time caps, and then maintaining the Q&A periods as sacred periods for you all to ask your questions and to make sure that we get a chance in real time to be hearing from the presenters about your questions. And so moving forward, that will be our format or enforced format rather. And we got a lot of great questions for the presenters in the second half of the meeting today. And we'll be getting responses to all of those questions from the presenters and sharing them with you all as assembly members in written form. Reminder that our next meeting is Tuesday from 6 to 8. And the topic is an introduction to climate change and climate mitigation. And we've got some great speakers. Wanting to thank you all so much for joining us on the presenter side, and then also assembly members for all of your thoughtful chat in the chat box, as well as questions that you brought forward. Have a wonderful rest of your weekend. For those folks that have a long weekend, enjoy your long weekend, and we look forward to seeing you all on Tuesday at 6 p.m. If you can join about 10 minutes before, we can do an audio check, a visual check, and just get everybody up and running. Thank you all so much, and have a great rest of your weekend. Bye-bye.